Last year, for my Christmas special, I did a video where I scientifically compared the red calves and green calves in order to determine which one is better. And with my completely unbiased and completely scientifically justified research, I was able to rig things enough that I could make the claim that red calves are just better as a whole than green calves. Unfortunately for me, one of the arguments that I had in favor of red calves was that Noish is better than Alec, and I've actually changed my mind on that pairing over the last year. Sorry Noish fanboy, I know you'll be watching this video. But I unfortunately have to face facts that giving the steel sword to Alec creates more reliable damage than relying on crits from Noish. It hurts me too, because this means that there is a tie between the red and green halves, and I can't let that stand, especially because I read on Reddit that next week the FE4 remake is getting shadow dropped, and Alec has a Master Knight promotion in that one. I could claim that Tearing Saga is an honorary part of the series, since the Red Cavalier Kreis is better than the Green Cavalier Arcus, but then that opens me up to the rest of Kaga Saga, and I have no idea which of the Christmas calves is better in those games. Better to leave that Pandora's box shut. So instead, I have to turn my eyes to the mainline games that I skipped during my initial evaluations, those being Gaiden and Three Houses. I still refuse to categorize Bowie and May or Lucas and Forsyth in the original Gaiden as Christmas Cavaliers. They did not have the red and green scheming back then. Their designs were instead updated in SOV in order to retroactively put them into the Christmas Cav archetype. But, in my opinion, that only makes the SOV versions into Cain's and Abel's. The Gaiden versions remain Happy Holidays Halberdiers. So instead, I'll look at the most popular game in the franchise, Fire Emblem Three Houses. Because of the way its join situations work, Three Houses resists the traditional archetypes. It doesn't have a Jagan or Goto, and in fact, units don't even join you on the battlefield, so there's no red unit or green unit recruitments. You could arguably say that the choice between Dimitri, Edelgard, and Claude is an Aaron versus Samson situation, but it's really just choosing a route split. Do we refer to Ryoma and Xander as Aaron and Samson? Well, actually, I'm sure someone out there does. Oh god fucking damn it. I just checked the fandom wiki to see if it had the Dimitri, Edelgard, and Claude decision listed under Samson and Aaron archetype, and it didn't, but it had fucking Catherine and Shamir listed because of the side quest where you give them the wheat stone for either a silver bow from Shamir or a silver sword from Catherine. I fucking hate the Fire Emblem fandom sometimes. I think in order to determine who the Christmas Cavaliers of Three Houses are, we should define what the Cain and Abel archetype even is. My friend Blue Cosmic, whose YouTube channel is linked below, created an alignment chart for the Christmas Cavaliers, using the scales of color and class. Color purists want the Christmas Cavaliers to be red and green because, you know, Christmas, and color radicals want them to be whatever color, it doesn't matter. Meanwhile, class purists want the Christmas Cavaliers to be Cavaliers, but class radicals think that they can be whatever class you want. If I had to place myself on this chart, I would say I'm a color purist class radical. But I think this alignment chart is kind of incomplete, because there is a third axis that the Christmas Cavaliers can run along, and that is their relationship. Blue sort of clumps the class and relationship with each other, but I would argue that they are distinct enough from each other that that shouldn't be the case. For example, Klon and From fell into the class radical category because they have different classes from each other, but their relationship is that they are Alir's two stewards. And thus, as a red and green pair that enter into the army with a pre-established relationship, I would argue they fall more into the relationship purist or relationship neutral category than someone like Odin and Nyx, who do have the same starting class, but they don't have any pre-established relationship with each other. The only thing these units have in common is that they're dark mages. They don't even join on the same map. So I'm scrapping Blake's alignment chart and making my own alignment cube. I don't really have a good representation for a cube as a 3D graph alignment chart type thing, so instead I'm just going to make 3 alignment charts, each of which is a different layer of the cube. It's hard to explain in words, but just trust me, it'll make sense with the visuals. Okay, so here we have the top layer of the cube. This contains pairs who fall into the relationship purist category. So all the Christmas Cavaliers must have an established relationship and contrasting personalities. With relationship purist, class purist, and color purist, we get Kent and Sane. Kent is a very stoic, serious knight, takes his duty utmost importance, and in contrast, Sane is a womanizer. He is a bit of a hothead. He doesn't really think, he just sort of acts without really thinking beforehand. They do obviously have the red and green color scheme, which has them fall into the color purist, and they're the 2 knights that set out together looking for Lady Lindis. They become sort of her retainers. They are the 2 primary members of the Lindis League, so I think all of that combined, you can say they have a relationship and they have contrasting personalities. And then, obviously, they do fall into color purist because they are red and green, and they do fall into class purist because they're both Cavaliers. Meanwhile, color neutral, we have the pink Cecil and the blue Luke, and they are both Cavaliers, so they fall into class purist as well, but their relationship is very similar to the one that Kent and Sane have. Cecil, the pink Cavalier, is more serious. She takes her duty to Marth seriously, whereas Luke is a bit of a womanizer, a bit of a goofball, kind of hothead, doesn't really think too much before acting. For the color radical, I have Clive and Fernand. Again, they are both Cavaliers, and a big portion of the story of Shadows of Valentia is about their contrasting personalities, their contrasting ideals, how Fernand is unwilling to team up with the common people, whereas Clive is. Clive is definitely more cool, collected, and rational, whereas Fernand seems to be driven by emotion and by sort of an entitlement that he has. Moving down to the class neutral row, we have Saizo and Kaze, who are the Christmas ninjas. They do have a pre-established relationship, they are brothers, and their personalities are contrasting. Kaze is more, cool-minded, and Saizo is the hothead. He's hot-blooded. He has the fucking pyrotechnic skill. He'll blow himself up. And the same is true for relationship purist, color purist, class radical, Oscar and Boyd. They're brothers, and they have the contrasting personalities where Boyd is a hothead and Oscar is cool as a cucumber. He's just chill vibes, okay? In the color-neutral class radical relationship purist department, Renak and Dazla have opposite ends of the spectrum in their red and blue, and arguably Dazla himself is just the Christmas berserker because his 2 primary colors are red and green. But they also have the pre-established relationship being La Rochelle's 2 retainers, or at the very least her traveling companions. And while Renak is cynical and just in it for the money, Dazla is optimistic and enthusiastic. He's just having fun. In the bottom right corner, we have relationship purist, color radical, class radical with Python and Forsyth. Python is the cynic and Forsyth is the optimist. But of course, Python is an archer and Forsyth is a soldier, so they do not have the same class as each other. Moving up to relationship purist, color radical, and class neutral, Bors and Barth are both armor knights, but Bors is the optimist who's doing his duty and cares about knightly honor, whereas Barth is more cynical and he's just doing everything for money, even going as low as stooping to arena grinding. And in case you're wondering, I'm not making that up. There is an actual support where Bors scolds Barth for being willing to arena grind. But the one I've been dancing around is class neutral, color neutral, relationship purist, where we have Lot and Wait. They do have contrasting color palettes and contrasting personalities, fitting into that hothead chill vibes dichotomy. And they're axe fighters who know each other from before the war because they grew up as neighbors. But where we run into a problem is that they are also the fighter duo, which is something that many people consider to be an archetype in and of itself. It's referred to in the community as Board and Cord, after the original fighter duo Maji and Saji. Only they weren't exactly a duo, were they? In Arcanea, you get Board, Cord, and Bars together, and the 3 of them have a relationship, such that in FE12 they had a triangle attack with each other. So what exactly is going on with the Axe Bros? Okay, I know we're already inside of a sidebar to talk about the Christmas cube, but we need to take a sidebar inside of that sidebar in order to talk about the board and cord archetype, as well as just the origin of archetypes overall. I promise this will be relevant. It's going to be on the quiz. It's going to be on the quiz. So don't skip this. This is going to be on the quiz. This is going to be on your midterms. It's important. You can't skip this. So, at risk of stating the obvious, these archetypes are not an official thing, they're fan-made. Neither Nintendo nor Intelligent Systems has ever come out and said, oh yeah, we insert the Cain and Abel archetype and the Goto archetype into every game. Instead, the labels come from fans picking up on patterns and naming them after the first instance of said pattern. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with this system, even if I do think some of the fan-made archetypes are quite silly. However, the reason that I bring this up is that the fans themselves creating these archetypes is relevant to what our modern idea of the archetypes is. As even though archetypes are usually named after a unit from Arcanea, they are almost always modeled after someone from Fire Emblem 6, 7, or 8. This is why Kent and Sane are the picturesque Christmas Cavaliers. They're Christmassy, they're calves, and they actually have contrasting personalities, as compared to Cain and Abel, who the archetype is named after, who don't actually have any personalities in the original games, and even when they get some supports in FE12, they don't really fit into the contrasting personalities that we associate with Christmas Cavaliers. The super strong endgame anti-softlocks that we call Gotos are pretty distinctly modeled after Athos from Fire Emblem 7. In fact, outside of the Tellius games, Athos is really the only Goto that feels like a Goto without needing to insert some sort of caveat. For example, Flavia and Basilio are a pretty cool free way to kill Garima in Awakening, but only if you go through the proper reclassing shenanigans. Anna and Nasir are technically anti-softlocks in FE9, but only if you give them Wrath Resolve, otherwise they're dealing chip damage to Ashnard. Goto himself, who the archetype is named after, is an incredibly weak unit in Fire Emblem 1, and he can't help you beat the final boss because the final boss is actually immune to all magic, and Goto can only attack using magic. And even though he does have the weapon level for Warp, he's almost certainly not going to be your Warper on the final map, thanks to the way that the game's trading system works. In my video about Jakens, I talked about how Oifi himself doesn't fit into the theoretical Oifi sub-archetype that some people believe in. And a big reason why this is that the so-called Oifi archetype was just people recognizing that Seth and Titania are good, but not being willing to apply that label to other Jakens. So they looked for someone from an old game who was roughly analogous to Seth and Titania, and decided that it was its own archetype. And I think something similar happened with the Axe Fighters in Game Boy Advance. Lot and Wade joined together in Fire Emblem 6, and Dorcas and Bartray joined together in Fire Emblem 7. And if you squint, you could say that Ross and Garcia are a pair of Axe Fighters that joined together, thus completing the Game Boy Advance trilogy of Fighter Bros. Combine this with the fact that in Fire Emblem 5 Thracia 776, Orson and Halvin are a pair of fighters who join in Chapter 1, and it does seem like there's a pattern of paired up fighters, which is probably what got people to look back at FE1, recognize that Board, Cord, and Barst joined together, so they named the archetype the Board and Cord archetype. And then it never came up again, because there is no other game in the series where two Axe Fighters join side by side, or even join close to each other with some sort of relationship. In fact, even if we look on the fandom wiki, there's not even any Axe Fighters that are similar enough that they can cope a archetype into existence. And the fandom wiki is absolutely great at coping units into archetypes, such as when they called Wallace the Goto of Lin mode. But I'm not talking about this just to hate on the Lot and Wade archetype. The reason I bring it up is that when looking for a definition of Christmas Cavaliers, we should be focusing in on the Game Boy Advance games. Because not only is that when the fandom first started noticing and labeling the archetype, It also appears to be when Intelligent Systems started more strictly adhering to it. Fire Emblems 1 and 4 had very distinct sets of Christmas Cavaliers, but 2, 3, and 5 don't really have a pair that cleanly fits in the same way Cain and Abel or Alec and Noish do. FE6 had a pair of Christmas Cavaliers, but a lot of FE6 is referencing FE1, and as such, a lot of units' join situations and groupings are similar to the join situations and groupings of units from Mach's first adventure. But they chose to carry Christmas Cavaliers forward, and stuck to the hot-headed versus cool-blooded dichotomy between them. And I think at this point it's happened enough times that we can say it's an intentional choice on Intelligent Systems' part. Especially since, as I mentioned earlier in the video, they retroactively retooled some characters' color palettes in the FE15 remake of FE2. Okay, with that out of the way, let's return to the Christmas Cube. Okay, back on track, we're in the middle layer of the Christmas Cube, and this is where the relationship neutral calves are. These are Cavaliers who do have an established relationship, but they don't have the classic contrasting personalities. And by established relationship, I mean something before the game starts, especially as we move into more modern games where the majority of the cast can support with each other, such as Awakening, Fates, and Three Houses. So, in the middle top left, we have Titania and Oscar, who are both some of the earlier members of the Grail Mercenaries. Oscar is green and Titania is red. I'm specifically referring to them in Radiant Dawn, since in that game they do both start as paladins, as opposed to in Path of Radiance, where Titania is a paladin and Oscar is a cavalier. But if you wanted to stress the definition further, you could potentially argue for the Path of Radiance inclusion. In the class-neutral, color-purist, relationship-neutral category, we have Lucas and Forsyth, but only in SOV, where they are Christmas Armor Knights. And in class natural, color purist, relationship neutral, we have Jafar with his red hair and Nino with her green hair. For those who haven't played FE7, Nino saves Jafar's life and nurses him back to health, and the two of them are bonded as a result. In color neutral, class purist, relationship neutral, we have Trek and Noah. These are the two Ilian Cavaliers who join as sort of replacement units for the Christmas Cavaliers of Fire Emblem 6. In class neutral, color neutral, and relationship neutral, the true neutral, we have Wolf and Sedgar. These are two of the members of the Wolf Guard, and they are both nomads as opposed to paladins or cavaliers or anything in that class line. Although technically they can reclass depending on the game. And in relationship neutral, color neutral, class radical, we have Shannon and Gatri, who are paired together in both Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn, having a deep friendship that goes beyond the normal bonds of the Grail Mercenaries. In class purist, color radical, relationship neutral, we have Makalov and Astrid, specifically referring to their Radiant Dawn iteration, because they have the pre-established relationship in that game, having started dating or gotten married or something like that, I forget which one. In class neutral, color radical, relationship neutral, we have Bors and Wendy, who are brother and sister armor knights. And in relationship neutral, color radical, class radical, we have the brother-sister duo of Ewan and Tethys. Tethys is the game's dancer, Ewan is a trainee mage, and obviously they have a pre-established relationship as a brother-sister duo, but their personalities are not contrasting. And moving on to the third and final layer of the cube, we have the relationship radicals, which means that the Christmas Cavaliers do not need to have any sort of relationship. They don't even need to have supports with each other. So for our color purist, class purist, relationship radical set, I picked Kyle and Emilia. Emilia is a little bit of a cheat because she does have the option to go general, and as we all know, that's optimal. But if you choose to throw for content and send her Paladin, then she and Kyle can be the Christmas Cavaliers. At least if you don't care about the Christmas Cavaliers having any sort of relationship or pairing whatsoever. In class neutral, color purist, relationship radical, we have Lewin and Azel. This one is also a little bit of a stretch because technically Lewin is a bard and Azel is a fire mage, but they're both mages, it's functionally the same class. And under color purist, class radical, relationship radical, we have Sed and Sias, often referred to as the Christmas Gotos, although I think mostly jokingly. Bishop and Sage are definitely similar, but I think they're distinct enough to fall into class radical. And, of course, these two characters do not have any sort of link to each other within the plot. They are a sort of Aaron versus Samson situation, so the units themselves are kind of linked, but then again, they can't both be in the army at the same time outside of in their join map, so it's weird. I would say that this qualifies as class radical, color purist, relationship radical, however. I don't know, let me know in the comments if you disagree. Moving on to color neutral relationship radical, class purist, we have Lex and Noish. You could, again, make the argument that Lex does not fall into class purist because he is an axe cavalier as opposed to a full pure sword versus lance cavalier, but I think they are close enough, and it's really hard to find examples for the color neutral department. Under color neutral, relationship radical, class neutral, we have Odin and Nyx. I stole this one from Blue's chart, but after talking about it, I was surprised to learn that there are actually at least a vocal minority of people who insist Odin and Nyx are the Christmas Cavaliers of Conquest, which is just kind of wild to me. Not only are they not in the red and green color scheme or Cavaliers, but they're also no link to them aside from just both being mages who don't even join on the same map. Odin joins in Chapter 8 and Nyx joins in Chapter 9. In fact, the only reason that these two characters even have a support with each other is because in Awakening and Fates, all of the male characters, with the exception of Crom, can support with all of the female characters, with the exception of Sumia. This, of course, excludes the Avatar sexual characters as well as cross-generational pairings, because those are not allowed. Speaking of Awakening, Olivia and Tiki fall into color neutral, class radical, relationship radical, as Olivia is the dancer and Tiki is a mannequin. In class purist, color radical, relationship radical, I have Alfred and Mavier, although you could also put Alfred and Amber in this category if you want to stick to more pure Cavaliers, or include Marin, since Wolf Knight is a promotion from the Cavalier line as well. Basically, any odd coupling of the various Cavaliers from Fire Emblem Engage would fit this categorization. None of them have relationships with each other, and none of them fit the red and green color scheme. For relationship radical, class neutral, color radical, I have Ace and Rex, the two playable soldiers from Fire Emblem The Last Promise, only for Game Boy Advance. And for the pure radical, color radical, relationship radical, and class radical, I have Meg and Har, two equally strong units in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn. So here we have the entire Christmas cube laid out to show the variety in different units who could or could not be considered pairs of Christmas Cavaliers. From the pure example in Kent Insane, to edge cases like Saizo and Kaze or Titania and Oscar, to off-the-wall stuff like Nyx and Odin. But in the process of making this cube and deciding who would be our example pairs for various quadrants, I realized that there is a fourth axis missing, and that in an ideal world, we would not have a Christmas cube, but a sort of four-dimensional Christmas hypercube. Because another factor that could determine just how pure or radical someone is in terms of their Christmas Cavalier status is join time. Traditionally, Christmas Cavaliers join on the same chapter, as is the case with Kyle and Ford. However, there are several pairs that are separated by a couple of chapters, such as Saizo and Kaze or Kieran and Oscar in FE9. And there are even some examples that people would point to as Christmas Cavaliers who are separated by vast swaths of the game, such as the FE3 iteration of Cain and Abel or Kieran and Oscar in Radiant Dawn, who exist in entirely separate armies. So while Kieran and Oscar would technically fit in relationship purist, color purist, and class purist, there are plenty of people who don't consider them to be Christmas Cavaliers because they join in separate chapters from each other. both in FE9 and in FE10. And there are some people who consider them to be the Christmas Cavaliers in FE9, but not in FE10, due to the increased distance between their join times in the sequel game. Now, I don't really have any way of making a visual aid for this 4-dimensional hypercube. It was hard enough to make a visual aid for the Christmas cube to begin with. So instead of giving you one for each of the different quadrants, I thought I would highlight what my own standards are for what qualifies as being a Cain and Abel. But here's the thing, is I don't necessarily think that I cleanly fit into any of these specific quadrants. If I were pressed, I would describe myself as a color purist, relationship neutral, class neutral, join time neutral, but I don't think that's entirely accurate to how I view the Cain and Abel archetype. In fact, there are examples that I can point to of people who I would consider to fall into the Christmas Cavalier category who do not fit all of those checkboxes. Klan and From are the most obvious example to me. They are a red and green pair who are closely associated with each other and join at the same time. However, they do not start in the same class. From is a martial monk, and Klan is a mage. But in many ways, despite being different classes, these are two sides of the same coin. Mages use offensive magic, and martial monks use defensive supportive magic. However, if these two characters joined several maps apart from each other, I would find it harder to convince myself that they are a Christmas Cavalier pair, despite all of the other elements lining up. That same logic is not applied, in my case, to Kieran and Oscar or Saizo and Kaze, because even though these two pairs join several maps apart from each other, they do also start in the same class. But speaking of starting in the same class, one of the examples I used for Class Radical was Jafar and Nino, and one of the reasons that I picked that out is I wanted to point out how starting in a different class versus starting in the same class isn't exactly a binary choice, even though it might appear to be one. Jafar is a pre-promoted assassin, whereas Nino is a training project mage. That feels like a completely different level of Class Radical than Oscar and Boyd, since they both start out as unpromoted units at relatively the same level. I also think it's potentially worth noting that many people, myself included, probably don't have a strict list of criteria for what qualifies as a Christmas Cavalier, but instead have a loose set of guidelines and include pairs that are close to meeting or meet most of the criteria. I'm strict when it comes to the colors, but anything else, and I play it pretty fast and loose. If somebody joins very far apart, are in different classes, and don't have any sort of relationship, I won't count them, but if they check 2 out of 3 of those boxes, then I probably will, regardless of which 2 it is. It's also potentially worth noting that looking at the wider context of the games can enlighten us as to who the Christmas Cavaliers are. Boyd and Oscar do seem pretty close until you consider that Oscar is already part of a Christmas Cavalier pair with Kieran, and I personally don't feel like one unit should be in 2 different Christmas Cavalier pairs at the same time. Basically, what I'm trying to say is the Cain and Abel archetype is a lot like pornography. I don't have a strict definition, but I know it when I see it. But if I'm going to try to make the case that there is an objective pair of Christmas Cavaliers in Fire Emblem Three Houses, I can't rely solely on my definition. I don't want to leave myself open to any allegations of bias while I am rigging the polls in favor of Red Cavaliers. So I decided to do what any good scientist would do in my situation. I crowdsourced a poll of about 400 random people on YouTube, and I'm pretending that that is representative of the general population. So I created a survey with a bunch of different options of pairs to fit into the Cain and Abel archetype. I made sure to refer to it as the Cain and Abel archetype because I felt that calling them Christmas Cavaliers would inherently add some bias to the survey in favor of the people who start out as Cavaliers instead of another class. I also included a write-in category so that if anyone felt there was a pair of Cain and Abel's that wasn't included amongst the options I gave, they could write it in. I want to start by just taking a look at the front half of the series, that being Fire Emblems 1 through 8. Although I did include 11, 12, and 15 in the same categories as 1, 3, and 2, just because I didn't want to repeat the same pairs through the remakes and non-remakes. Yes, there are a couple of pairs that I think become Christmas Cavaliers in the remakes, such as Lucas and Forsyth or May and Bowie, but are not in the original. But since this was just an information gathering survey, I thought it would be simpler to group the remakes and the games they're remaking together. Right away we can see that all three of the Christmas Cavalier pairs from the GBA trilogy were very solidly in the 90% of people who think that they qualify as Cain and Abel's. Likewise, Cain and Abel from Fire Emblem 1 have a 98% success rate. I do find it vaguely interesting that there is a higher percentage of people who checked off Cain and Abel than any of the GBA Cavaliers, even though arguably all three pairs of GBA Cavaliers qualify more than Cain and Abel themselves. Remember, Cain and Abel do not have contrasting personalities, and in FE1, they don't even fit into the fast versus strong archetype. Much like I mentioned earlier in the video, most of these archetypes were based off of the Game Boy Advance era. But it seems like because they were named after the characters from Arcanea, people more closely associate them with this duo. Although apparently not enough to overcome the join time gap, because the FE3/FE12 variation of Cain and Abel was only marked as part of the archetype by 77% of respondents. Granted, this was still significantly more than the other options I gave for FE3, that being Dolphin McKellen, Merrick and Ellerin, and Luke and Rhodey. Although some people did write in that Luke and Cecil or Rhodey and Cecil should have been included as well, which honestly, that's an oversight on my part. I should have included all three possible permutations of the starting three Cavaliers as potential Cain and Abel's. Personally, I don't think any of the three qualify, but I know there are people who stan all three pairs. Moving on to the Judd Girl games, Alec and Noish had a respectable 82% success rate. And honestly, I think the only reason it's that low is due to the number of people who didn't check off their box as they hadn't played FE4 yet. The Thracian pairs were even lower, and while some amount of this can be attributed to people not playing Thracia, I think a large amount of it is how questionable the claims that both Osin and Halvin have, as well as Cain and Alva. Personally, I would label Cain and Alva as this game's Cain and Abel, because they do feel like a parody of the Christmas Cavaliers, but I can see the argument that neither of them are. I do not, however, feel that Ocean and Halvin deserve to be a Cain and Abel archetype, and that is my line in the sand. Not because I think they're bored and cord, but simply because I don't feel they have enough in common with the other members of the Christmas Cavalier archetype. The biggest deal breaker for me is I don't feel their designs are close enough to the red and green festive dichotomy. On the other hand, I do think that Lucas and Forsyth are definitely Christmas Cavaliers, or I guess more accurately Christmas Soldiers, or Christmas Armors. They were retroactively made so in the remake, at least in my opinion. This is definitely a contentious topic though. Only 57% of respondents felt that they qualified for the archetype, and I have to imagine that some amount of that was my grouping FE2 and FE15 together. Weirdly, May and Bowie got a higher score at 62%. I feel like May and Bowie are an edge case. I'm willing to hear out the people who think that they are in the Christmas Cavalier archetype, but personally, I tend to lean away from them being so. I included them in the original video because May is definitely better than Bowie, and I'm biased in favor of the Reds, but if I'm being honest, I don't consider them to be festive enough either. And I was happy to see that Alm and Celica only got a 5% success rate. I hear people refer to them as Christmas Lords, so I included them on the list because I felt like it was a popular take, but apparently it's not, and that's good because it's one that I just don't agree with. Moving on to the second half of the graph, we can see that as intelligent systems begin to experiment with different Christmas duos, the consensus around which one should be considered part of the archetype became less concrete. In fact, the only pair to crack the 90% mark is Stall and Sully from Fire Emblem Awakening. And this makes sense, they are definitely the closest to the traditional Christmas Cavaliers. They're both Cavaliers, they've got the right color scheme, they've got the personality duality, and they join one chapter apart from each other. The next closest pairing we have is Oscar and Kieran at 85%, but only for their Path of Radiance iteration. It is potentially interesting that despite the difference in join time, a large number of people will still label them as that game's Christmas Cavalier pair. I guess it makes sense, again, red and green, and also they're both Cavaliers. I've always considered them to be the Christmas Cavaliers of Path of Radiance, but I've heard a lot of naysayers reject this idea, so there must be a vocal yet definitely existent minority of non-Kieran and Oscar believers. And of course, that number only goes up as we enter Radiant Dawn, since Kieran and Oscar are in different armies from each other. Kieran begins as part of Joffrey's Royal Knights, and Oscar begins as part of the Grail Mercenaries, although eventually the two armies merge with each other towards the end of Part 3. This pairing only had a 50% success rate, which is definitely a noticeable drop-off. I find it interesting that more people consider Cain and Abel from FE3 Book 2 to be a Christmas Cavalier pair than Kieran and Oscar from Fire Emblem 10 Radiant Dawn. Because the argument for these characters being considered their game's Cain and Abel is basically the same. They are the Cain and Abel from the prequel game, so they should still be considered the Cain and Abel in the sequel, even though their join situations are more spread out from each other. I again think that the Cain and Abel name is doing a lot of heavy lifting in the public perception of Cain and Abel from New Mystery. The last set of pairs that got enough votes to, in my opinion, warrant consideration are Saizo and Kaze from both Birthright and Revelations, and Klon and Fromm from the most recent title, Engage. Saizo and Kaze are in almost every way the spitting image of the Game Boy Advance Christmas Cavaliers. They have a relationship, they have the red and green color scheme, they're diametrically opposed to each other both in personality and in their stat lines. The only difference between them and the Game Boy Advance pairings is their class line is Ninja, although it is notable that the Ninja class is the Hoshiden equivalent of Nor's Cavalier class line. For those who are not aware, each of the classes in Fates has an equivalent from the opposite nation. This is data that is mostly unused, although it does come up for inheritance to second-generation children at times. Most of the parallels are the sort of thing that you would think. Outlaw is parallel to Archer, Wyvern is parallel to Sky Knight, and in the case of Cavalier and Ninja, those are the parallel classes to each other. So, in many ways, Saizo and Kaze aren't just the Christmas ninjas, they're also Christmas Cavaliers. Just Christmas Cavaliers of a different nation. Before we move on to Engage, I do want to note that Saizo and Kaze got fewer votes in their Rev appearance than their Birthright one, but I have to imagine this is just because fewer people have played Revelations. Okay, so Klon and Fromm. 75% of respondents felt that they qualify as a Cain and Abel duo. The only duos who reach a lower threshold than 75% are Oscar and Kieran of Radiant Dawn, and SOVs May and Bowie and Lucas and Forsyth. And I think it makes sense that more people would disqualify them than any other pair we've talked about. They don't start in the same class, although I would argue that offensive magic and defensive magic are two sides of the same coin. Unlike the ninjas, they don't have any sort of relation to the Cavalier class line. Technically, Klon can promote into Mage Knight, but that to me is pretty distinct from Cavalier. Moreover, on the relationship front, despite being linked to each other by being Alir's stewards, Klon and Fromm do not have personalities that oppose each other. In fact, their personalities are very similar. They're both enthusiastic fans of the Divine Dragon. Fromm is more enthusiastic than Klon, but they start a fan club for Alear together. They're pretty similar to each other. There's also potentially the argument that From is closer to pink than she is to red. Her personal skill is Crimson Cheer, so to me that indicates she's meant to be red, but Intelligent Systems just made her a lighter shade of red. But like, when I first saw her, I definitely thought the primary color was meant to be pink. And I can't imagine I'm the only one. I wouldn't say that Klon and Fram are uncontested Christmas Cavaliers, but 75% is still a pretty big majority, so they definitely fall into the archetype in a large number of people's minds. Okay, so what have we learned from looking at this graph? Well, unfortunately not much. We've learned that red and green is incredibly important, as none of the pairs that didn't fall into that color scheme even made it particularly close to a majority score. We've learned that being a Cavalier is not necessary, but it definitely helps a lot. The red and green Cav pairs by and large scored significantly higher than the red and green Ninjas or Stewards did. We also learned that distant join times isn't necessarily a disqualifier, but there is a limit to it. For example, in Path of Radiance, Oscar joins Ike's army in Chapter 1, and Kieran joins Ike's army in Chapter 11. Because of some weirdness around Oscar's availability, he has 9 more chapters in Ike's army than Kieran does, and to many people, these 9 chapters are not enough of a gap to disqualify the duo from being a Christmas Cavalier pair. On the other hand, in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, Oscar joins Ike's army in 3-P, whereas Kieran joins Ike's army in 3-11. Because of weird availability stuff in Fire Emblem Radiant Dawn, this means that Oscar is in Ike's army for 9 chapters longer than Kieran is, which is far too long of a gap, explaining why only 50% of people feel that this duo qualifies as a Christmas Cavalier pair. Wait a minute. Ah, fuck, I think this chart might be useless. So it seems pretty clear to me that the numbers are more heavily influenced by people playing and not playing the games than I initially assumed. Thracia, Mystery/New Mystery, and Radiant Dawn are definitely the least played games in the franchise, and I believe that is actually what reflects their Cavs having lower scores, rather than any other element. The same goes for Revelations having nearly 20% lower score than Birthright, and if I can't trust Tellius and the Fates trilogy, then I can't trust anything. We're going to have to go back to the drawing board. Instead of using this absolutely worthless graph, I'm going to ask some targeted questions on my YouTube community tab. Definitely more reliable and scientific. And just by coincidence, this is also a source that is easier to weigh in my favor. Okay, so the first poll that I want us to take a look at is whether or not the Cain and Abel archetype needs to be red and green and needs to be Cavs. 75% of respondents said that they felt it could be any red and green pair, regardless of whether or not they were Cavaliers. Although I did get some comments indicating that they would have liked to be able to choose both option 2, it's any Cav pair, colors don't matter, or option 3, it's any red and green pair, class doesn't matter. Because they want them to fulfill one of the 2 criteria, but not necessarily both. And I do find that interesting, at least. For our purposes in finding the Christmas Cavaliers of 3 houses, I will say that red and green is mandatory, but Cavaliers are preferred. Next, I asked about the number of pairs, and it seems like most people felt that you could have multiple pairs of Christmas Cavaliers, but only 1 per each army. So, for instance, you can have Lucas and Forsyth in Alm's army, and May and Bowie in Celica's army, but you cannot have 2 pairs in Celica's army. I decided to get a little bit more granular and asked about multiple examples from the grid cube thing that we did earlier. Most people do not consider Oscar and Boyd to be a Cain and Abel archetype, and honestly, I agree with them. And most people consider Klon and Fram to be a Cain and Abel archetype. Again, I agree with this assessment. Next, I asked whether or not people thought that the 3 houses cast even had a Cain and Abel pair, and it looks like 90% of people said no. In fairness, I also don't think Three Houses has a Cain and Abel pair, but we're going to ignore that for the sake of this video. Again, it doesn't matter. No, we need to find out who they are. So the much more important part of that community post is looking through the comments, because I asked people to suggest who the pair was if they felt that the game did have a pair. And so those 10% who said yes gave me a large number of suggestions to work with. The game does have a lot of units who are paired with each other by their personalities, and so people gravitated towards Catherine and Shamir, I guess because Catherine is a hothead and therefore the Red Cavalier, and Shamir is more calm and therefore the Green Cavalier. I don't really see it in their outfits, although many people insisted that they do have red and green color schemes. Catherine has a little bit of red on the inside of her skirt, and Shamir has a bluish teal color. I guess you could argue that that's green if you're colorblind, but I will be honest, I do not think Shamir's scheme has any green in it whatsoever. Other pairings I saw suggested were units like Raphael and Ignatz, or Annette and Mercedes, but neither of these fit the color scheme criteria. Although, if you do look in the Crimson Flower route, Linhardt is a green mage dedicated to healing, and he is antisocial, he just wants to sleep, whereas Dorothea is a red mage dedicated to offense, and she is extremely social, she wants to find a husband or wife. If people are willing to accept Klan and Fromm due to the fact that they are a healer and a mage, then the same logic might apply to Dorothea and Linhardt. My hesitation is that they don't really have a relationship with each other. I don't feel like they're matched up in, like, the main story meant to be closer than any of the other students within the houses. And of course, because they're not Cavaliers, it's not as solid as it would be with some of the Cav pairs. Speaking of which, one pairing I saw suggested frequently was Sylvain and Ferdinand, since they are both Cavalier-focused units, and they both have access to the Swift Strikes combat art. But, much like Dorothea and Linhardt, they don't really have a relationship with each other. In fact, they have even less in common than Linhardt and Dorothea. They don't have diametrically opposed personalities, and they don't even have a support chain with each other. Sylvain does have out-of-house supports with two other Cav-focused units, those being Leonie and Lorenz. Personality-wise, he makes for an interesting contrast with Lorenz. Both of them want to get married, but he wants to do it because he's a womanizer, and Lorenz wants to do it for, like, noble title nobility reasons. From a gameplay perspective, Sylvain has more in common with Leonie, however, as both of them learn brave combat arts. Sylvain has the aforementioned Swift Strikes, but Leonie gets point-blank volley instead. But the problem I have with these pairings is that, yes, they do have the riding boon and whatnot, but does that make them Cavaliers? Like, Three Houses doesn't really have traditional class lines. And so if we're trying to find out who the Christmas Cavaliers are of Three Houses, shouldn't we be focusing more on the Christmas and less on the Cavaliers? And if we're focusing on red and green, then I really think Dorothea and Linhardt are the only ones that make a reasonable case. It's definitely a stretch, but there's a lot linking them. They have a support that reaches all the way to A rank and even includes a B+. The healing and offense dichotomy is also supplemented by the fact that each of them has a relationship with a teacher. Hanneman is linked to Linhardt because he's teaching Linhardt how to be a crest scholar, and the opera links Manuela to Dorothea. They have contrasting personalities, and if you want to dive for an even deeper link, they're both some of the limited queer options you have for romancing Byleth. So, if we've accepted that there has to be a Cain and Abel pair in Three Houses, I don't see any reasonable argument that it's not Linhardt and Dorothea. Well, actually, Linhardt learns Warp, and Dorothea doesn't really have anything special going for her. Fuck, this is not a victory for the Red Cavaliers. Okay, we're throwing this pair out the window. Let's investigate the canonical classes of every unit in Three Houses. Okay, first let's knock out the easy ones. Byleth, Dimitri, Edelgard, and Claude are all considered to have their personal classes as their canon classes. In addition to that, all of the faculty members start out in an advanced class, and I think it's reasonable to assume that this is also their canon class. So, Catherine is a Swordmaster, Sedith is a Wyvern, Aloy is a War Master, Shamir is a Sniper, and Gilbert is a Fortress Knight. Hanneman and Manuela are also pretty clearly meant to be a Sage-Bishop dichotomy. Manuela technically could access Gremory, but she has a reasoned weakness, so she's unlikely to be meant to access it canonically. And we see further evidence of this with her appearing as an enemy bishop during Dimitri's paralogue on the Blue Lions route. With that in mind, I think the two most important sources for our determination of canon classes are going to be appearances as enemies and the class that they join you in if you recruit them out of house. The out-of-house classes never go beyond intermediate, so they can't give us the final class line, but they can point us in the right direction. For example, Bernadetta, Ashe, and Ignatz are all archers in their out-of-house classes, pointing to the possibility of either Sniper or Bow Knight being their final destination. But speaking of Sniper and Bow Knight, I want to talk about the advanced versus master class phenomena, because for the most part, the master classes are not a strict upgrade over the advanced ones, but simply a side grade. The only exception to this, I would say, are the Falco Knight versus Pegasus Knight, and the Wyvern Lord versus Wyvern Rider. In those cases, I think it's fair to assume that anyone who ends up in the advanced or intermediate class does eventually make their way towards the master class. But, for example, there's no clear master class that is an upgrade over Paladin. Holy Knight and Dark Knight exist, but they aren't upgrades so much as side grades. And the same goes for Bow Knight versus Sniper and several other advanced to mastery classes. Swordmasters then cleanly go into Mortal Savant, and I don't think we should assume that Catherine ends up as one. She's a Swordmaster through and through. Similarly, because Shamir does not specialize in riding, I think it's safe to assume that she stays in the Sniper class line instead of going to Bow Knight. It is worth noting that this would be an interesting pair for the Cain Enables because the Swordmaster is a traditionally 1-range locked single weapon class, and the Sniper is a traditionally 2-range locked single weapon class, but as I previously stated, I really don't believe that the color schemes are red and green, and so I'm disqualifying the lesbian couple on those grounds. In contrast to these two, Gilbert has a riding boon, and he starts with C rank in riding, higher than the normal E that you would have in all other skills. So I think it's reasonable to assume that his canonical class is actually Great Knight as opposed to Fortress Knight. Great Knight is still something of a side grade compared to Fortress Knight, although it is much closer to a strict upgrade than the other classes I've mentioned. So yeah, I'm willing to say that that is his canonical class. The last two non-house associated units we haven't talked about are Cyril and Flayn. Cyril appears as an enemy Wyvern Rider, and Flayn appears as an enemy Bishop. Therefore, I think it's safe to say that they are both in those class lines. And because of the budding talent in reason, I'm willing to say that Flayn ultimately promotes to a Gremory once she hits level 30 canonically. With all of them out of the way, I want to go through the roster of students now. Okay, so I figured as a visual aid, I would just have the kids, the students from the house selection area where you were able to look and see at them. So we already talked about Edelgard because she is in her personal class of Emperor, but Hubert shows up as a Dark Warlock on multiple enemy maps, and he has Dark Magic. He's the only male with Dark Magic to my knowledge. I think he's just pretty definitively, canonically, a Dark Warlock. I don't think there's much to question about that. Ferdinand shows up as an enemy Paladin. And you could make the argument of like, oh, well, he has axes, so he could like go into Great Knight or whatever, but I think Ferdinand von Aegir is just a Paladin, just a plain old Paladin. He strikes me as a plain Jane Paladin. Linhardt, enemy bishop. He specializes in faith magic. And because males can't be Gremories, the fact that he has reason magic as well doesn't really change anything in that regard. He is just a bishop. That is, to me, pretty clear. Now, Caspar shows up as an enemy War Master, and he specializes in axes and fists. So, again, very clear-cut, canonical class is War Master. I don't think there's much to argue about there. Bernadetta is where the first sort of question mark comes up, right? So, she shows up as a sniper in Gronderfield 2, and she's above level 30. Which is the cap for promoting from Sniper to Bow Knight. So, you could make the argument that, well, if she's at level, or if she's above level 30, she can be like 41 in Maddening or something ridiculous. And she hasn't reclassed to Bow Knight, then her canon class should be Sniper. But she also has a budding talent for riding, which does suggest the Bow Knight option. I'm going to make the call that... See, because I want to say, because she's level 41, she's above level 30, the cutoff, right? We should just trust her enemy appearance as that's her canon class. But then that impacts Dorothea, because Dorothea is also above level 30, and she's a Warlock. And it feels weird for Dorothea to be a Warlock when she has the skill set for both Gremory and, the sword one. What is it called? Mortal Savant. And while Mortal Savant is definitely a side grade, Gremory is almost entirely an upgrade over Warlock, unless you... What do you even get from Warlock? It's like fire. So I feel like we should say that Bernadetta's canon class is a Bow Knight, because that is consistent with Dorothea's canon class being a Gremory, which is a strict upgrade over Warlock, in the same way that Sethith joins as a Wyvern and we give him credit for the final stage Wyvern, because it's a strict upgrade. And we give Pegasus credit for becoming Falco because it's a strict upgrade. I think we give female Warlocks credit if they have the ranks for it, which Dorothea does with budding talent. She's a Gremory as her canon class. You could also argue Dancer, because she has swords and she has the opera company thing. I don't think there's a canonical Dancer. I'm not going to say any person's canon class is the Dancer. I think there is no canonical Dancer. The Dancer is whoever you choose to make Dancer. And Petra is a pretty straightforward. She's Assassin. She shows up as an Assassin multiple times. And it fits her personality and supports and boons. So Petra is an Assassin. Moving on to the Blyans. We had the Bleagles, and now we're at the Blyans. And Dedue is pretty straightforward, in my opinion at least. He's a Fortress Knight. He has the Riding Bane, so not going to upgrade him to Great Knight, but he appears as a Fortress Knight multiple times, sometimes as an enemy, sometimes as an ally, and his boons lead directly into that line. I know that he does also have the boons that lead towards War Master, but he never shows up as one. Pretty clearly intended to be a Fortress Knight is my reading. Felix shows up frequently as a Sword Master. He does have the budding talent in Reason, and so you could make the argument that he canonically goes Mortal Savant. I think I'm going to say his canon class is Sword Master because of those frequent appearances, and because Mortal Savant is more of a side grade than a strict upgrade. Well, actually, you just lose Astra, which isn't as big a deal as losing the Hunter's Volley. I'm gonna say Felix's canon class is Mortal Savant, under the same logic as Bernadetta and Dorothea. Felix's canon class is Mortal Savant. For Ash, he goes down the Archer Sniper role, but does not go to Bow Knight because he doesn't have that riding boon. He is canonically a Sniper, also canonically a Durable, but that's less important to our purposes. Sylvain is a Cavalier. I do not think that he is a great knight. He actually, in many ways, parallels Ferdinand, except for that they don't have a support with each other. I see why people suggest them as a potential Cavalier or Christmas Cavalier pair, but again, they do not have the color scheme. But yeah, Sylvain's canon class, Cavalier. Mercedes's canon class is Gremory. She has the strengths for it. She only ever shows up as an enemy bishop, but I really do think that because she starts out with the Reason Boon, Reason Bane, she graduated from the Ferdiad School of Sorcery, I think that her canon class should be Gremory. And in contrast, Annette, I think that her canon class is Warlock. She does not have a Faith Bane, or Faith Boon. She doesn't have Faith Bane either, but she doesn't have the Faith Boon. So yeah, I think Annette Warlock is the class for her. Ingrid is the only character who joins you as a Pegasus Knight, and I think that that pretty straightforwardly puts her in the Falco Knight class line as her canonical class. So that is, I feel like there should be one of every class playable, or at least one of every class. So that's my logic there. And finally, the Gadir. I don't really have a good shorthand for the Golden Deer, but Lorenz shows up as an enemy paladin several times, but he also perfectly has these strengths that align with Dark Knight, and I feel like if we want to have a Dark Knight, there's not really a better candidate than Lorenz. So he's going to be our Dark Knight canonically. Raphael is a War Master canonically, both in terms of the class that he's in when you fight him, and also just that is what the boons line up with. So he is pretty straightforward canonically a War Master. Ignatz is a sniper, both in terms of when you fight him in the post-time skip maps, and also because he does not have a riding boon or hidden talent. Lysithea is a Gremory. I know she shows up as an enemy Warlock, but because she has the boons in both Reason and Faith right off the bat, similar to Mercedes, I think that we're just going to go ahead and slap Gremory as her canonical class. It just makes sense. There's no reason for her not to proceed that way. And then Marianne is an interesting case, because Marianne is the only character who you cannot fight in a post-time skip map. The implication is supposed to be, or at least I think the implication is supposed to be, that she commits suicide if Byleth isn't her teacher. So, there's stuff that you could say about the portrayal of that, but for our purposes, what's important is that we don't have anything to base it off of other than her strengths, weaknesses, and her pre-time skip class. Pre-time skip, she is a priest, which could go into bishop. However, she has a budding talent in lances and a riding boon. So I think she's supposed to be the canonical Holy Knight of the cast. I feel like that is the role that she falls into most readily. She even has a weakness in brawling, which you can't use brawling arts while on a horse. So, I guess we could see that as further evidence for that. Hilda is an enemy warrior, and she is the only enemy warrior, well, of the playable cast, the only enemy warrior. So I think that she's our canonical warrior. I think that just makes sense. And then Leonie shows up as an enemy paladin, but there's a lot of evidence pointing towards Bow Knight as her canonical class. She does have the bow boon. She gets a bow in her paralogue. It's not a personal bow. I almost said a personal bow, but it's not a personal bow. But she does do a paralogue about trying to get a bow. She has a bow-related combat art. I feel like there's a lot pointing towards her being a Bow Knight, which is kind of a side grade compared to Paladin. And I think that's where she would ultimately end up. We have the DLC characters left to talk about. Yuritsa has a personal class, so that is pretty clearly his canonical class. Anna, I feel like, is supposed to be a trickster. It aligns with her boons and banes, and also the history of the character in her previous playable appearances. And the 4 Ashen Wolves each have a DLC class associated with them in the Cindered Shadows campaign. Yuri is a trickster, Balthus is a war priest, Constance is a dark flyer, and Happy is a Valkyrie. Not only do these classes align with their boons and banes, but they are also what they are locked into for the Cindered Shadows campaign. And since the Cindered Shadows is canonically the story revolving around the Ashen Wolves, whereas they aren't really involved in the plot of the main Three Houses story, I would say the classes that they are locked into for the Cindered Shadows campaign are their canon classes. I don't really think there's much room for debate there. In the interest of being as generous as possible, I'm going to count every horse-mounted class as being Cavaliers, so we can have more candidates for our Christmas Cavaliers. This means that Ferdinand, Sylvain, Lawrence, Leonie, Marianne, Gilbert, Yuritsa, and Bernadetta are all candidates for the Cain-and-Abel archetype. But looking over this motley crew, I really can't find any pairing that qualifies. None of them really match color scheme-wise, although Bernadetta and Leonie could be the Halloween Bow Knights. And none of them align personality-wise either. I'm beginning to think that this is a lost cause. Maybe the closest we have is Linhardt and Dorothea, and I should just accept that this is yet another loss for the Red Cavaliers. Unless... wait a minute. Red and green. Hold on. Red unit, green unit. The Christmas Cavaliers of Fire Emblem Three Houses are green unit Geralt and red unit Death Knight. Geralt dies in all 4 routes, but Death Knight only dies in 3 of them. Therefore, the Red Cavaliers win. Case closed. Boom, we win. These sorts of scientific endeavors would not be possible without the generous funding of my patrons. So, thank you to Michael Kraus, Len, Gameboo, Karosa, Fyrant, Smaz Ruby, Floho Gamer, Lizard Bongwater, Johnny Petrolno, Maren McLean, Calamity Callie, Adele, Thaythom, Andu, Reflect, YLO1, Jamie Collins, Mean Jojo, Thick Molder, Arvis, Tailored Muffin, George Grenville the 7th PM, Floahay, Gabe the Green, Control Aegis, Roman Kormanzik, Nick Knack Hammersmack, SUP, Caius Cole, Bell Wenska, Dysyke, Ginger, Root Beer Pants, Queen Elizam, Aerith Emblem, and especially my Jagans, Christopher Bueno, Lilzabeth, Autumn Kelsey, and Julia Kyoto. I truly appreciate your support more than I can express in mere words. If you are interested in backing my next unbiased and scientific endeavor, there is a link to my Patreon below, and benefits include things like early videos, polls that influence the direction of the channel, and a couple of other things that are too spicy to mention on YouTube. But I know this time of year can be expensive for people, so please only donate if you can comfortably afford to do so. I don't want Fire Emblem to be the last straw in your financial bag. Free ways to support the channel include liking, commenting, subscribing, and if you want to leave a comment, make sure you include the comment code word TOMATO so I know you made it to the end of the video. But regardless of what you choose to do, I hope you have a wonderful day. Stay safe and stay warm, gamers.